Welcome to the History Extra podcast, fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. Did tragedy or comedy go down better with ancient Greek audiences? Were the crowds raucous and rowdy, or quiet and civilised? And how did the wrath of the mischievous god Dionysus spark an Athenian cultural festival? Speaking to Emily Briffett, the classicist Sarah Nooter answers your top questions about the theatrical antics of ancient Greece, from advice on stage management to how much the plays of today really owe to their ancient antecedents.
Hi Sarah, thank you so much for joining us on the History Extra podcast.
Hi Emily, thanks for having me. I'm happy to be here.
We are going to be delving into the world of the ancient Greek theatre. So firstly, I wanted to ask you, how do we actually know about this world?
Well, it's complicated. We have a number of tragedies and we have some descriptions of that time period, but a lot of the really specific information we would like to have, we only know through incidental comments. So Plato might be discussing education and might, along the way, mention something about what happens at the festival where theater is performed, but he will not give us a full account of all the details we would really like to have, or we won't find that we have an encyclopedic entry or any of the kind of information we would like. So we make some guesses around small comments and remarks often enough.
So hopefully that'll help frame us as we're talking about this, that we're getting drips of knowledge, but not necessarily the whole picture.
Yes. I should add that we also do have an archaeological record that's very helpful. We have the theater of Dionysus itself is preserved to a large degree in Athens. We have other theaters. We have inscriptions and different kinds of evidence that we bring together to try to build out that world of ancient theater in Athens in the 5th century.
And hopefully this is a world we'll really be unpicking. But first, I should probably ask you, what are the origins of theatre in this time? What do we know about its earliest iterations?
Well, that's one of the things we don't have perfect information about, but we do have an account by Aristotle. So Aristotle now is coming in the 4th century, so he doesn't have perfect knowledge, but he guesses that tragedy arose from what we call dithyrambic performances. So you had choruses of citizens, young men, maybe 50 of them, who were performing songs for the god Dionysus. And it's suggested that maybe at some of these performances, a single speaker would separate himself from the choral group and start a sort of dialogue. And we actually have a poem that works like this by the poet Bacchylides, which is a dialogue between a singer who is essentially playing Aegeus, Theseus' father, and then a chorus of Athenians singing back and forth to each other. And that looks very much like what a kind of proto-tragedy might have looked like, where after that you get a second speaker and then a third, and now you're off and running and you have dialogues between characters and you have a chorus that's also part of the action, but commenting on the action. That also helps us place tragedy in its context, which is in the theater of Dionysus and the festival of Dionysus. So it's an act of worship to the god of theater. And then we also have some theories around when it started, which would be, we think, in the 6th century BCE. And the legend is that you had a playwright named Thespis, who was the first winner of the festival. And I think that's pegged to around 534. And the idea is, and so this is more myth than reality, but that he won the prize, and the prize was a goat. And that's why it has the name tragedy, which is goat song. It's a very mysterious title. And again, this is just a theory. We don't know for sure, but we do know that the tragic festival begins in the 6th century. It begins while Athens is still under tyrannical reign, but it comes to be associated with the democratic Athens that we see in the 5th century.
Athens really has this legacy of being one of the more culturally developed, I guess, of the ancient Greek city-states, with this really strong connection to the theatre. Could you touch on this a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, Athens really does have an amazing wellspring of culture in the 5th century. So this is perhaps its most stable period. So we're looking at our earliest tragedies are coming to us in the 470s. So there are earlier ones, but we don't have them. And you have also the building in the 5th century of the famous Parthenon on the Acropolis, and other programs of government and art are coming into being and all springing up at once And you also have a great wellspring of an inscriptional record in Athens, and in Attica around Athens. So there's a lot of writing, there's a lot of culture, and just every way you could imagine culture. There's a lot of building, and there's just a lot of arts. And one can speculate as to why that might be. It could be that you actually do have a democracy, and that allows more people to thrive, although it's not a democracy like we might have one. You can speculate that it's also a period of stability, but there also must be some kind of interesting crossroads of values. Thucydides gives us a really famous comparison of Athens and Sparta at this time, and he says, Sparta is by far the more powerful city-state. But he says, generations, hundreds of years from now, when we look at the two places, we're going to think that Sparta was some kind of backwater and that Athens was the big culture, because Athens has all of these buildings and Sparta just does not invest in that. And he's absolutely right. I mean, there's like practically no ancient Sparta that you can go see now. But of course, you can travel to Athens and you can see some of these amazing buildings still preserved in that area. And so we don't exactly know why Athens is such a powerful sort of producer of culture, but we do know that festivals are a really important part of that. Festivals are how people come together, how they worship the gods, and it becomes an area of sort of growth and acculturation among the people of Athens.
Speaking about festivals, could you tell us about the Festival of Dionysia?
Yeah, so that is a very important festival at Athens. It's the second most important festival. The first one is at Panathenaea. So these festivals would happen on an annual basis. This one was in the spring. So we think like late March, early April. And that's an important time of year because that's when the ocean around Athens becomes fordable. That is, people could visit Athens at that time. And so it becomes a festival that is for outsiders as well as insiders. It's a display of Athens. And the festival it's about a 5-day festival. It begins with parades, we call it Pompeii, and a kind of ritual bringing of the effigy of the god Dionysus into Athens. And the myth behind the ritual is something like that Dionysus originally came to Athens, was rejected, cursed Athens with a plague that hit male genitalia particularly and fertility, and then the Athenians repented and they accepted him, and now we have a festival that marks the re-entry of Dionysus into Athens. So the festival may have hints of a sort of fertility rite, or it certainly has hints of a kind of harvest festival, because this is also when you have the springtime, and so you have these big parades. You have sacrifices before the populace. You have later a more drunken parade. On the second and third day, you have other rituals like the parading especially during the Peloponnesian War, which starts in 431. When a lot of men are dying in war, you have their orphans brought on stage and the Athenian government promising to provide for the education of the orphans. You have tributary states who are presenting their tribute to Athens. And so it becomes a kind of international affair. And then the day before the tragedies begin, the tragedians will present their choruses and present their themes for that year. And then you will have 3 days of tragic performance. So we think on each day, a tragedian like Aeschylus would have 3 tragedies performed, and then a fourth play called a satyr play. And then on the final day, starting in 487, comedy starts to be included as well. So you have a day of 5 comedies. And one thing about all of the tragedies and the comedies separately is that it's always a competition. It's not just that you have the tragedies being performed just for fun. You then have a big judgment about which playwright is the winning playwright. And so that's a really important piece, that in Athens, everything is what we call an agon. Everything's a competition. And that aspect of competition also makes its way into the tragedy itself, because you frequently see scenes in tragedies where characters are facing off with each other in very impassioned arguments, and that's the big agon moment. And that's where we get a word like protagonist, like the first actor in a play. But I guess what's really important to emphasize about the city Dionysia is that it really brings together a huge amount of the populace. Thousands of people went to see these plays. The theater was enormous. And there was a provision for people who couldn't afford tickets that the government would help them pay for tickets. It's really considered a civic right to be part of the city, to be part of this culture. You go and you see the tragedy, you know the tragedy. It's just an important part of what it means to be an Athenian.
There is absolutely so much I would like to touch on in your response there. But I'm curious, we've spoken a bit about Athens. What do we know about the other cities?
I mean, we know some, but we know less about them. Tragedy is being performed also there are smaller festivals, kind of rural Dionysic festivals happening around Greece. And often we think the tragedies that were first performed in Athens would travel around. Some of them would first be performed elsewhere. But we don't know that other cities like Corinth or Thebes, certainly not Sparta, had this same kind of central festival or concentration on tragedy the way Athens did. It's truly an Athenian invention.
I'm curious about one thing you said there is about the travelling plays. Now, were productions sort of local amateur productions, or were they established theatre companies, I guess would be the modern term, or were they more travelling troupes?
We don't know a ton. I think traveling troupes is probably a good way to think about it. So when you have a tragic production, you have a chorus. It changes size over the course of the 5th century, but I think in a Sophoclean play, you'd have a 15-member chorus. Those would be citizens. So a citizen would spend 6 months of the year, if he was chosen to be in a chorus, training to be in the chorus. He would get out of his martial duties by doing this. However, the actors are professional actors. So the playwrights we know of, like Sophocles and so on, also acted. And they probably did travel. They probably, because there are actually 2 dramatic festivals in Athens every year, the Dionysia and then a smaller one called the Linnea. That's probably not enough for a working actor. So we know that they probably then went ahead and went elsewhere to do their performances.
Outside of the actors and the chorus, who else made up I guess we could say theatre company, but that's a very modern term, but who else was part of it?
That's a good question. So we don't know everything, but we know certainly that the playwright himself was very involved. So he would be, the ancient term from Athens in the 5th century was didaskalos, which means teacher. So that means he's a teacher of the chorus, but it also comes to mean that in a certain way, the tragedy is a teacher in Athens. It teaches certain values. And so the playwright would train the chorus, would teach them the music and the dancing, which happen in every chorus. It might act. And there were also other city officials who organized the festival and brought it together. But in terms of who was responsible for costumes, for masks, for staging, we don't know those things, unfortunately.
Talking about maybe a city official, do we know who perhaps funded the theatre? Was it perhaps a regional ruler, or was it the local populace, crowdfunded almost?
If you were a wealthy person at Athens, instead of having much higher taxes, say, you would be chosen honorifically to give large liturgies to the people, to the populace. And this could happen if you were a citizen or if you were what was called a metic, which was a non-citizen living in Athens and granted certain rights, but not full citizenship. And so these very wealthy citizens might pay for a trireme, a ship, or they might pay for, say, Sophocles to put on his plays one year. And so the city would still be responsible for keeping up the theater and, for helping with citizens who need help for tickets, for example. But you call upon these private citizens to receive, in a sense, the honor of doing the service to Athens, right? This becomes their way of becoming prominent in Athens. Similarly, a citizen might fund a chariot in a chariot race in the Olympic Games, right? So these are ways that you leverage your wealthy citizens, but you also give them prominence for the way that they give to the society.
And were plays only performed in theatres, or were they performed elsewhere as well?
As far as we know, they were only performed in theaters, but it might be that theaters don't have to be as fully developed as we think of them as being. A lot of the images we have of the way theaters looked come from the Roman period. And so theaters in the Greek period we think are more simple. they're kind of more, they're theater in the round. They have a very simple background called a scene. So not a ton of stage setting, we think. A central doorway is really important. It usually, the scene represents the palace or the domestic space. And then the chorus and some of the actors would come in through side columns or, say, entranceways called paradoi. And you had a lot of symbolism that happened between just the space where somebody was coming in. Did that space represent the wilds of Mount Corinth? If somebody came in from the house, did they control that home space? The center of the stage would have an altar on it, which was a real altar where sacrifices were made to Dionysus. But a lot of plays also make use of the altar in the actual action of the play. And so an important sacrifice will happen, and it happens at that altar. So then you have a quasi-religious space on stage. You also have the chorus that's performing in between the actors and the audience, and are in a sense playing a mediating role and helping the audience to understand and interpret what's happening on stage. So it all sounds very complicated, but that's all done with really a small amount of fuss. You don't have curtains, you don't have in some images you'll see, or in archaeological remains of Roman stages, you have levels, different levels, but you didn't have any of that in the Greek theater. No archways, none of that. Very simple. The skene, you may have heard of a deus ex machina, the god who enters late in the play. There is a crane that they could use for that, and the person would be lifted above the stage on the crane, and so they could make a divine entrance. So that was a bit of fancy staging. But it was simple enough that I think, well, you probably would always have performances in theaters. The theaters could be pretty rudimentary.
This was going to be my question. I was going to ask you about the props and lighting and staging, because I think today we are so familiar with the red velvet curtains, yes, and all of the glory of all the intricate artwork and detail. But I guess this kind of brings us on to the question of things like costume, because I guess this was where the real, I don't know, feeling of the play could be given. What costume was actually used?
Well, that's one of the things we don't know a ton about. Anyone who can should go to Greece or other parts of the Mediterranean world. And during the summer, you'll find there are a lot of festivals that travel around to this day and perform plays, sometimes Greek tragedies, in these theaters. And what you see is you can't do anything with lighting because it has to be daytime. There are many things that cannot be done, but what you get is still a quite incredible performance that usually, in a certain sense, makes use of the space and the light around it. And the sonic capabilities of these stages, where the audience seats become a kind of echo chamber, are quite impressive. So within that, you have your actors in costumes we really don't know a ton about. Most of what we know about costumes and masks come from vase painting, and usually a bit later. So we have, I mean, we can only imagine that costumes were pretty simple because the actors had to be seen from quite far away. So we're not dealing with really intricate, detailed pieces. We can't see the faces of our actors. We can only see their masks. And they had to communicate from quite a distance. So we think that they were fairly naturalistic, but so not those like crazy masks that you see images of from later in antiquity. But also they're simply not there to be too expressive, right? They're kind of almost a blank space that the audience can project their ideas of the character onto and see from very far away. There's one more thing about the actors that I should say, which is very different from how we do theater now. I mentioned the term protagonist. And so the protagonist, that literally means proto-agonist, first actor. The protagonist would play the actor with the most lines in every scene. And then the second actor would play the actor with the second most lines in every scene, and then the third actor would play the person with the third most lines. And that means that the same actor might well play two different roles in a play. So there's a play called the Trachiniae by Sophocles, and the whole first half of the play revolves around Deianira, who's the wife of Heracles, and then she kills herself. And then the second half of the play revolves around Heracles himself. And the same actor would have played both Deianira and Heracles, wearing a mask so that you never saw the person's face, but would obviously have to do a lot with their voice to express different characters at different times. So the whole idea of what a character is and how an actor performs and how you recognize them and how emotion is being transmitted must just be really different from what we do.
That's incredible. I never knew that.
It's odd.
In a way, this brings us onto a question of you're talking about playing multiple characters, but we've had a question from Thomas Kendall on X, so formerly Twitter, who was asking about whether women were allowed to perform. I think we often hear of Shakespearean times of boys playing female parts. Was this a similar case in ancient Greece?
Absolutely, yes. Women were not allowed on the stage, not at all. And so you have a situation where not only are women played by male actors and male choruses, even if they are supposed to be female characters, are also men. But you have a very strange situation where a lot of Greek tragedies give you these very powerful women who are out in the public eye, who are doing sophisticated, powerful things, running the show. And that's very, very different from the way we understand life to have been for women in Athens at that time. Right? Women in Athens lived a very cloistered domestic life and really didn't have public rights of any kind that we can see, except maybe for priestesses. So not only do we have a situation where Greek tragedy really focuses to a large degree on the lives of women, but we also have women with all this power being played by men in a society where women did not, where they would have been horrified by the idea of actual women having that power. And it just creates a kind of mystery around gender that has really fascinated a lot of scholars.
With that in mind, what do we actually know about the performance style of the actors?
Well, we don't know a ton. Most of our direct information comes from offhand comments. So in the life of Sophocles, a much later work, there's a comment that he was good at portraying women because he had a high voice. So that's an interesting little comment. It's not very much, but it gives you a clue as to what people were noticing and what they were looking for. And a lot of what they were noticing really had to be vocal instead of being visual. Because remember, they're wearing big masks. We can't see the actors' faces. So the way they communicated would have had to happen through their voices and through their gestures. And they would have had to communicate to the guy sitting all the way in the back seat at the top of the theater. So they'd have to be broad gestures. And so the vocal style gives a lot of range for performance because all of tragedy is poetry. Every line of tragedy is a poetic line. And just as much of Shakespeare is an iambic pentameter, much of tragedy is an iambic trimeter. So that's supposed to be the verse form that's the closest to natural speech. However, in the tragedies, the choruses were always singing, or they were singing in lyric song. And sometimes characters would also sing, and especially they would sing at moments of great emotion. So you see in Sophoclean plays that the heroes, when they're under great duress, will shift over from speaking in iambs to singing in lyrics. And this shows the level of emotion and also maybe shows their kind of emotional power that their character has. And so we can really use the vocality that we find in the verse forms to understand more about how we would see performance happening on stage.
Now, I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about the types of dramatic genre that were performed? I think we've touched on all of them in part, but it'd be good to go into a bit more detail about them.
Yeah, so tragedy is the big one. It's the famous one in the ancient period as now. It's the most influential, and it's considered the most serious. And as you know, tragedies took, by and large, mythic themes or mythic stories that are already circulating. So a lot of the stories that have to do with the Iliad and the Odyssey, you don't necessarily retell the Iliad, but you take a piece of the story. Or often you take something that looks like a Nostos story, a return story, and retell that. Or you could take a piece of the Oedipus myth. And so Oedipus's story comes from a long family history of a lot of trouble. So you can take a piece of that story and you tell it in a tragedy. Or you can tell the story of Medea, which comes from a different mythological tradition. But all the mythological traditions are kind of linked. There are a couple examples of tragedians telling historical stories. But famously, when a tragedian tried to do that about a contemporary situation, he was fined. The Athenians were so upset that he received a large fine and was told never to do it again. So they didn't want to be confronted with their day-to-day problems on stage, right? The temporality of a tragedy has to be removed. And the only exception we have now to that rule is a play by Aeschylus called The Persians, which told the story from the Persian perspective of the Persians' defeat by the Athenians. And that had happened a decade or so before the play is staged. So that's a very interesting exception. It also is our oldest play. So that's tragedy. And then you have comedy. Comedy is like just a super weird genre. Because old comedy, which is what we have in the 5th century, so really traveling alongside tragedy, is really unique and doesn't really follow through our historical tradition into the present. Old comedy is about situations that are set in the present tense, often in Athens. You'll often have an Athenian character, kind of a trickster hero, but a bit of a rube maybe, who's trying to do some crazy thing like bring peace to the entire Greek world. I mean, that doesn't sound crazy, but he's trying to do it by riding on a dung beetle up into the heavens, so that gets a little crazier. So you're set in the present, you have present day problems, and characters who are pointing out to the audience, who might be making fun of audience members who are there in the audience. But then wacky, crazy things happen, like characters traveling to the heavens or starting a bird city or other things like that. And so they're kind of fantastical, but they're also political, and they're set in the present, but they're also things that couldn't actually happen in the present. And they're very funny and scatological and kind of sexual and sort of crude. But what's really fascinating about this genre is that it kind of comes to an end, and it's quickly replaced by what we call middle comedy and then new comedy. New comedy is a genre, a form of comedy that comes later in the 4th century. And the big Greek comedian we have, and we don't have much of him, is Menander. And he writes these sort of situational comedies that are like, so-and-so is in love with so-and-so, but doesn't realize that she is his adopted sister who was taken away at birth because of a prophet, and so forth. And so this kind of thing becomes what we see in Roman comedy, and then is picked up in the European tradition and really right up through Shakespeare. These are kind of small-scale family situational comedies. That political comedy that we see in the 5th century, we can find parallels. We can look to kind of late-night talk shows, things like that. But we don't see a tradition that starts in Athens and then just carries through the way we do with other forms. And then there's a third kind of play that I mentioned before. This is the satyr play genre, and this is even more mysterious. After our 3 tragedies would be performed on any given day, there would be a satyr play. And these are just, they're fantasy-oriented plays where the chorus is made up of beings called satyrs. And so they're kind of half animal, half man guys, sort of goat-like creatures with big phalluses. I mean, they're played by actors, but are played by choral members. And there's usually some kind of plot, like there's a kidnapping and a rescue. And it's just like a little wild, silly play. We don't have much of it. We only have a couple partial satyr plays left. And as far as we can tell, you get to the end of watching 3 intense emotional tragedies, and the satyr play is there for just a kind of silly release, we think. It's a little hard to tell what it's doing there.
Do we know which genre was the crowd favourite? This is a question we've had from Monica Del Vale.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think tragedy was the blockbuster. It was just the big one that really felt important to Athenians right from the start. It was right there at the center of their culture. Comedy, it's a little harder to tell what the world around comedy was because there was a lot of controversy. You would have people suing a playwright because they felt they had been slandered on stage, or you might have the Athenians get angry about a play, which also happened with tragedy a few times. And then the playwright might rewrite that play and perform it again. So I think that comedy was so much in the middle of political argument that it was fun, but it was also kind of quarrelsome in a sense. And so it was surrounded by controversy often. Whereas tragedy, even when it fell into controversy, it had such centrality in the culture immediately That you would have to say that was the popular one. That's the one that Plato is arguing with all the time, or arguing about, because it's so important culturally.
Do we know whether there were any recurring themes, or even maybe recurring jokes or gags or characters that keep cropping up?
In tragedy, I think, yeah, there are definitely thematic ways to understand the plays that keep coming up and that become stronger as history goes on. I mean, tragedy starts being more of a choral performance in Aeschylus, and then as we go through Sophocles and Euripides, we get more and more of that picture of the tragic hero, who's at the center of the play, who's facing some kind of big dilemma. And I like to frame a certain moment that happens in some tragedies, I call it the tidrasso moment. And in Greek, this means, what am I to do? And so there comes to be a moment, there's one in an Aeschylus play, but then many more later, where a central character will say, tidrasso, what am I to do? What can I do? And so tragedy becomes important in framing kind of what it's like to be a person who's right in the middle of a dilemma and needs to figure out in real time what they're going to do about it, if they should value what they're hearing from the gods, if they should value their desires, or they should value their family, or they should value their reputation. So what I think it turned out to be the case was that tragedy was very good at framing the dilemmas of particular people. And that becomes more and more the way we see tragedy playing out as we move down through the 5th century. With Aeschylus, the earlier plays, we see more like family dramas, sort of mixed up values. Nobody knows what justice means. How do you reconcile the demands of what happened to your parents with what's happening now with your spouse, and so on. How do you reconcile the demands, and this is a very central question, of the household, the oikos, with the city, polis, the values of the men around you or of the army. So that's always a kind of dilemma that's behind tragedy. Now in comedy, we only have full plays from one playwright in the old comedy tradition, and that's Aristophanes. But across those plays, it's really easy to see that there's a kind of Aristophanes hero, who's like this a guy who's often kind of on the make. He's a little bit vulgar, but he's dynamic, and he wants to change things, and so he dreams up some kind of scheme, and he starts moving the puzzle pieces around, and so that comes up a lot. There's a lot of scatological humor, just a lot of stuff about farting, about sex, just all the stuff you might imagine. A lot of making fun of citizens. There were a few citizens that Aristophanes especially did not care for, that he would make fun of a lot in his plays. So there's definitely a really clear set of jokes that you would, once you get used to Aristophanic comedy, you start to see these jokes over and over again.
Okay, so we've spoken about themes, but what about plays? Do we get a sense of what plays were particularly popular, or whether there were some particular favourites of the audience, or is this something that is lost to time, unfortunately?
Well, this is the kind of thing we can build out through the literary record. So we have some knowledge. We know that there's a trilogy by Aeschylus called the Oresteia, and that we know that becomes immediately a really powerful marker of the tradition. And so that even later, and a few decades later, we have the other playwrights making fun of it. Like they'll take a scene, and like, for example, there's a scene in the second play of the trilogy where a sister realizes her brother has come home because she sees his footprints on the ground, and they have the same footprint because they're brother and sister. In a later play, they kind of redo that scene, and the character says, but why would a brother and sister have the same footprint? That's ridiculous. So it's a sort of joke on a scene that clearly was incredibly well known among Athenians, or else it wouldn't be a good joke. And comedy is also really good for letting us know what people thought about tragedy, because there are a lot of jokes about tragedies. So we know that tragedies were familiar enough that you could make jokes all through comedies and people would get those jokes. And we also can see through other texts, like especially Plato's dialogues, which are a bit later, where he does a lot of quoting of tragedies and discussing of them, what would have been in the forefront of people's minds, what were good examples to use. Euripides is famous for having been very, very popular with Athenians, but winning. So there was a competition, as I said. Euripides won much more rarely than, say, Sophocles did. So he was somehow on the cusp of being very popular, but not as not as having the same high status as the other playwrights. We know that Sophocles was valued very highly. And we have one particular play by Aristophanes, an extraordinary play called The Frogs. And this is performed right at the end of the 5th century, so it's like 405. And the idea of the play is Sophocles has died. So Aeschylus had been dead for a while, but Sophocles and Euripides had just died. And in the play, Dionysus, the god, is the main character. And he really feels that the playwrights who are alive in Athens are not very good, and that Athens is in big trouble and needs guidance. And that's true. They were about to lose the Peloponnesian War. And so the character Dionysus goes down to the underworld in the play in order to bring back a playwright in order to save Athens. And what results is a sort of tragic competition within the play between Aeschylus and Euripides. And so this is the kind of thing you can imagine. It's a very funny play. It's brilliant, but it also is just a wealth of information about what were kind of the values of tragedy, what seemed good, what seemed stupid, what you might argue about, what was famous. So that is often what we think of as our earliest piece of literary criticism that was really telling us so much about the values around tragedy. And one of the things that's amazing about that is that the framing in this play from 405 is that, look, there are 3 great playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides. And in the present day, that's precisely also what we say. There are 3 great playwrights. Those are the ones we have plays from. We don't have any of the others. We have fragments. But these were the 3 greats. And so our story looks sort of suspiciously exactly like the story we're told at the end of the 5th century.
I think so much of what we've been speaking about is about reading through the gaps in our knowledge to come to some sort of conclusion about history. We've had actually a question from Holly Dolly Doodah on Instagram who's asked about if we could make a very rough estimate, what proportion of plays would we say could have actually been preserved? Or is that a very impossible task?
I mean, I think we could just say a really small percentage. So we have, you take Sophocles, we think he wrote, I don't know, something like 92 tragedies. We have a lot of titles. And we have 7 of them. And then we have fragments of some of the others. We have lines here and there. So that's a small percentage. For Aeschylus, we also have 7. For Euripides, we have more like 18. One might be false. And those are also just 3 playwrights of many dozens more. And so when people like me are making sort of scholarly arguments about how tragedy worked or what we find there, we have to be very careful to use the phrase extant tragedy, which means of the tragedies we have, we can see the following. And it's become more of an obligation, I would say, on the part of scholars to make sure we're looking at the fragments as much as we can, because the fragments give us a lot of information. They're harder to make your way through. They're often so fragmentary that you really can't get a lot. But they give you important contextual information to understanding what we do have.
And to follow on from that, how do we have the plays that we do have? This is a question we've had from Sweden, Hungary.
It's a fantastic question, and it's a great story, actually. There came a certain point in the 4th century where it became clear that that these tragedies were pretty great. At this point, you don't have as many new tragedies being written that have the same cultural cachet. And so, and you also have at this point the rising power of actors. And so an actor would want to have the best monologue possible, and they might perform a kind of medley of monologues from the great tragedies. And you start to have a problem of interpolation. So an actor might want to beef up his role a little bit and throw in some extra lines to Medea's speech. And so in order to preserve the tragedies in their sort of original state without interpolations and so on, official copies are created and stored at Athens. And then time goes forward. And as you know, we come to have the library at Alexandria. We have our first scholars. And they become really interested in keeping records of all the great literature of the day and of the previous centuries. And so they famously, they asked to borrow the original copies of the tragedies. And this, again, is Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides at this point. And then once they have the copies, they give up their ransom so that they can keep the original copies. And they make copies and they send them back to Athens. And they keep the original copies in the library. And this begins what we call a manuscript tradition, where different copies are made of the tragedies and they get passed down. And so that's how we have most of them. In the case of Euripides, the reason why we have more of his plays than the others is because there was a famous discovery of a kind of a library roll of plays, the ones that begin with H and I, to put it in Anglophone terms. So that's how we have tragedies. But in terms of fragments, usually when we talk about fragments, we mean one of a couple of things. And by that, it's usually quotations. So if Plato is talking about an Aeschylus play that he thinks is good, he might quote a line or two, or Athenaeus might quote a little bit of Euripides, and those give us the fragments that we have, and you bring them together and you start to get some bulk, and then sometimes we get fragments from papyrus finds. So we still have instances today where rolls of papyrus that were used in Egypt, where the climate is more forgiving for this kind of thing, are found, and they can be expertly unrolled and read. And you might find there, very occasionally, you might find great examples of literature, or a little bit of a tragedy, or a little bit of a lyric poem. And so that enters our corpus, and it's a part of how we come to learn a little bit more all the time about the ancient world.
I think that's absolutely fascinating. It's really interesting, though, how it's actually come down to us. The other side of things I really wanted to touch on before we finish up for today is we've spoken so much about the plays and the actors, but I wanted to also talk a little bit about the audience themselves. What would you say is perhaps the audience experience if you were to sit in an ancient Greek theatre?
But I think it would be just splendid. I would love to do it, but I think it would be a really communal experience. Like, one of the mysteries of Greek tragedy is whether women were present in the audience. And we don't actually have an answer to that, which is very strange. We have little clues we can use. So one of the theories that was once put forth to me by my own advisor, Helena Foley, was that probably there were women in the audience, and maybe they were just important women, like the wives of important men or priestesses. But when you take the Olympic Games, and we know women were excluded from that context, around that, we have stories of women sneaking in to see their son perform and so on. We have no stories like that around tragedy. So that in a way you can read into that silence the possibility that this wasn't an issue, this wasn't a problem for the Athenians. The other way we try to understand the answer to that question is just by anecdotes. We have little stories. So a story that comes from much later it's a fascinating story. It's that in the third play of the Oresteia, the Furies, who are these terrifying goddesses, come kind of roaring out onto the stage. And according to the story of this performance, all of the pregnant women in the audience miscarried, and all the babies who were in the audience died just right away, which is quite a story. But it also suggests that, of course, there were women in the audience, and that there were even children in the audience. And one of the things that we can sort of see just by the architecture is that you not only had the thousands of seats in the theater itself, but because the theater was set into the south slope of the Acropolis, and you can still go today and see that Athenians could have also sat behind it on the sort of the hill of the Acropolis and watched the theater from sort of behind, which would have made it an even more wide cultural phenomenon with even more people able to take part and see the plays. So it seems like a cultural phenomenon that we almost don't have good parallels for today. On occasion, you might have a sports event or a political event that brings in the entire culture to some degree. But the centrality of this and the communal nature of it, I think, is hard for us to kind of wrap our minds around.
I think this is my other question about audience and perhaps audience participation. Were audience members expected to act in a certain way? Could they applaud or boo or cheer, or were they meant to sit there quite quiet and civilized?
This I think we don't know perfectly, but we do know that in comedy they would certainly have vocal reactions. And but Plato, Plato was not a fan of democracy, and he used a certain word, which was thorobos, for crowd situations. A thorobos was the noise that a crowd or a mob makes, the kind of roar of a crowd. And so when we think about the judging of the plays, we know that there were actual judges and that they voted, but we think the audience also provided a kind of thorobos roar of approval or disapproval. And so one of Plato's fears is a kind of theatocracy, the power of crowds, the power of the audience in a theater, who are so moved by emotion, because that's the level on which tragedy touches you, that they become empowered as a great roaring body that can sway things one way or the other way. So there must have been some kind of theatrical roar, or else that would have made no sense when Plato said it.
When do we start to see the decline, and is there a decline in theatre in ancient Greece?
A lot of scholars have felt that the decline comes with the decline of Athens at the end of the 5th century, and then came a wave of scholarship that said, no, right through the 4th century and after, tragedy remained important. I'm sure that's true. I think the form of it did change, and I think it's almost like what we can see if we look at Broadway in New York, that when you look at the earlier history of Broadway, you hear of these original plays making a big smash. And that still happens to some degree. But if you look at Broadway today, you see Cats, and you see, I don't remember, all the other, Phantom of the Opera and so forth. The way that you make a big hit on Broadway is to bring one of these big crowd-pleasing shows back. And I think that starting around the 4th century, that's what you start to see. Like you're going to get to see the Oresteia again. And there must have been new productions, but they just don't have the same sort of cultural size and heft and cachet as the previous ones did.
To move on to legacy, how much would you say modern theatre actually owes to the ancient Greeks?
I mean, I think everything. I know that's maybe that's an overly classicist view, but everything, tragedy is absolutely invented. Oddly enough, it's just invented here in Athens. And I think I can't see any theatrical tradition, including Shakespeare, making any sense without that background. And I think that, if one gets involved in the world of theater and you start going to plays, one will note that there's a lot of tragedy, Greek tragedy, still being performed, and sometimes it's adaptations. But even you just take the opera or the musical, all of that really owes a ton to Greek tragedy as well. And many people will say operas are much closer to original tragedies than our kind of modern day sort of black box theater kind of performance. So if you want to understand theater, if you want to understand what that experience is meant to do, you just have to go right back to Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, and then Plato and Aristotle, and try to understand how this came about and what they thought was amazing, what they were afraid of, why it was so powerful then.
With that in mind, where would you recommend people either visit, or what should they read or look into to find out a bit more about ancient Greek theatre?
Well, I would say that if you ever have a chance to see a Greek tragedy or an adaptation, that would be your first line of attack. And of course, to read the tragedies themselves is a fantastic experience, and there are many great translations available. But there are also texts that one can read that are really helpful. I remember actually reading the Cambridge Companion to Greek Tragedy when I was a college student, and I think it's still excellent and it has really wonderful essays on tragedy. Aristotle's Poetics is a pretty short text. He's not right about everything, he's coming later, but he gives us a lot of insight into how tragedy might work and how it might have started. Or go to Greece, go see the Acropolis, go see the Theater of Dionysus itself.